Hey guys, Josh from the Ancient History Guy here. Hello and welcome to all. I hope you're having a fantastic day. Today we are going to be diving into the mysterious ways of the ancient Celts, specifically a rather gruesome practice carried out by the war bands of the people, headhunting. But why were the Celts so obsessed with this? Well, let's find out. So to give you guys some context, the Celts were a highly religious people. Their religion was a sort of mystic, superstitious, strange nature religion. We know surprisingly little about this religion, as the Romans, who would later conquer much of the Celtic world, made an effort to actively stamp it out, viewing it as barbaric and, to be honest, a little bit too weird for their culture's taste. Unlike the more refined religions of Greece, Rome and the East, Celtic religion was largely based around sacred groves and other natural shrines, known collectively as nimitons. A small scattering of Celtic people did indeed build their own temples to the gods, but these were more often than not on top of or near already existing shrines. Water seems to have been a very important part of religion, as many of the practices seem to have revolved around offering gifts to the gods and then depositing them in water. Needless to say, religion held an extremely important part in Celtic life. Noticeably, the religious priests, the Druids, were extremely powerful and respected beings. Indeed, warring tribes could be convinced by the mere presence of a Druid to cease hostilities, and there are a few examples of Druids literally coming in between armies and stopping a battle in the process. Like other religions, the Celts often sacrificed animals in order to appease their gods, and in desperate times seem to have sacrificed humans, something that the Romans and the Greeks were not particularly fond of. Indeed, this later part of Celtic religion seemed to have been trumped up by the Celts' snobby neighbours, who would tell elaborate stories of human sacrifices, sometimes even claiming that some human sacrifices were on a grand scale. One of these mass sacrifices were in the form of wicker men, huge effigies of a man made out of wicker which criminals were herded into and then set alight. Sufficient to say, the human form actually had quite a lot of meaning and power to the ancient Celts. Indeed, it was largely believed that a man's power and wisdom sort of radiated through his body from his head. As a result, the head held a special significance in the ancient Celtic religion, with various head cults cropping up all over the Celtic world. The Celts believed that when you cut off somebody's head, the power and wisdom that person once had now belonged to you. As a result, the more heads you in theory possessed, the more powerful and wise you were. This meant that headhunting became something of a must-do if you were a warrior, as all warriors wanted to be as powerful as possible. Celtic warriors began to scour the battlefield for heads to collect, with many nobles usually attaching the heads to the bridles of their horses and then returning with them to be displayed in their homes. These heads were generally treated with great respect. They were, after all, a source of power for the previous owner, and so should be treated as powerful objects in their own rights. They were often preserved, noticeably in cedar oil, and put on display in the new owner's home. They even went so far as to be prized possessions that were regularly brought out and displayed when a warrior was hosting guests in his house. Needless to say, this both fascinated and disgusted the more civilized Greek and Romans. Greek historians had this to say about the Celts' weird obsession with collecting heads. Quote, "They cut off the heads of their enemies slain in battle and attach them to the necks of their horses. The blood-stained spoils they hand over to their attendants and striking up a pagan and singer-song of victory. And they nail up the first fruits upon their houses, just as do those who lay low wild animals in certain kinds of hunting. They embalm in cedar oil the heads of the most distinguished enemies, and preserve them carefully in a chest, and display them with pride to strangers, saying that for this head one of their ancestors, or his father, or the man himself, refused the offer of a large sum of money. They say that some of them boast that they refused the weight of the head in gold." Of course, the Greeks and the Romans were naturally disgusted by this barbaric act, proof that the Celts were wild, barbarous animals, and yet the Romans in particular were not against beheading someone. In fact, they actually viewed it as quite an honourable way to die, so it was usually reserved for those that were, well, famous enough to warrant such an execution. Indeed, the famous orator Cicero was not only beheaded, but his hands were also chopped off. The Romans and the Greeks, simply put, could be just as brutal to their enemies. They just saw this method of killing as the perfect way of making propaganda against the Celts, who were a majority of the time their enemies. Sufficient to say, it's a case of the Greeks and the Romans' hypocrisy, condemning something when they themselves also regularly did the same. However, the sheer amount of hatred and propaganda written against Celtic headhunting is actually probably one of the main reasons why so many Celtic nations feel a sort of connection to their Celtic past. As mentioned before, the Romans and Greeks made an effort to stamp out much of what they didn't like in Celtic lands they controlled, including the Celtic religion. However, what they wrote about the Celts survived and fascinated later writers and historians from those lands. As a result, the head especially became a symbol of Celtic culture, with many famous Celtic tales, such as Gawain and the Green Knight, revolving around the power of a decapitated head. So, weirdly, in an effort to stamp out the practice, the Romans and Greeks actually preserved the religious and spiritual aspects behind it instead. So, what do I think of this? Well, I think it's definitely a unique part of history to look at. I find it more fascinating that the Romans tried so hard to stamp out the Celtic pagan religion, yet their writing, meant as propaganda, actually preserved it, almost like one would, funnily enough, preserve a pickled head. The idea of carrying out the act is frozen in time, yet we can all see the reasons why the act was carried out. But those are just my thoughts. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. Thank you for watching and listening to our videos. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe if you've enjoyed. All sources are listed and linked in the description below. I've been the Ancient History Guy, and as always, I'll be seeing you later.